So who am I? My name's Chris Allman. I'm a senior hydraulic modeller and hydrologist at Mott MacDonald. I'm also a chartered water environmental manager with CIWEM. And I have 15 years experience working in flood risk, flood modelling and hydrology in the UK. In my day-to-day job, I'm a technical lead on flood risk management projects, working mainly for clients such as the EA, local authorities, and organisations like Canal and River Trust who need flood risk advice. With my other hat on, I'm also the chair of the Pennine branch of the British Hydrological Society. So if you have, feel free to contact me about any of those things after today. There's my email address. I'll put it up at the end as well. So what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully you've come to the talk today with some questions that you're maybe thinking sound interesting. So hopefully I'm going to answer those today. So this is what I'm going to talk about is first what happened at Toddbrook Reservoir in August 2019. It feels like quite a long time ago now, and quite a lot's obviously happened since then, but it's important to reflect. And then secondly, how did flood modelling support the incident recovery, and how was it that that can support something which is obviously a very on-site situation? Then next, what can the model teach us about the incident? And then lastly, what can I take away from this for my next project? And then some questions at the end. So I think the aim was to finish, wrap up about 12:30, but that's the aim. So firstly, what happened at Toddbrook Reservoir in August 2019? This is a bit of an iconic photo with the Chinook. So firstly, as an introduction to Toddbrook Reservoir, it's a large raised reservoir in Whaley Bridge in Derbyshire. It's a Category A reservoir under the Reservoirs Act. And here's a photo of it. Some statistics: it was constructed in 1831. It's operated by the Canal and River Trust, and it's used to feed the canal system downstream and provide water for that. The dam's got a puddle clay core, and it's a 310-metre long dam, which is a maximum height of 24 metres. And when it's full, it impounds a volume of approximately 1.24 million metres cubed. So here's a schematic and a map of the reservoir. So it was built to impound the Toddbrook, which flows from west to east in this photo. The key things that matter for what we're going to talk about are the Toddbrook flows into the top end, where it comes to an inlet weir arrangement where water flows into the reservoir. At this point, there's also a penstock where water flows around the side into this bywash channel, which is a dotted red line. The bywash channel looks a bit like this. It's a small channel that carries water around the side and diverts it around the side and around the front, dropping down steeply in front of the dam to return to the River Goyt at the bottom. In normal conditions, a Toddbrook Reservoir is held, the water level in the reservoir is held at the primary spillway, which is this pink line here on the top left. This primary spillway is 40 metres long, and in normal conditions, water would flow over the spillway into the bywash. And the bywash is quite narrow at this point, and it goes around a corner, and it's a bit of a complicated hydraulic situation in this case. And when it fills, it flows over here into the bywash, and it's a risk that the primary spillway will back up and drown out when the flow in the bywash is exceeded, capacity of that bywash is exceeded. There's also an auxiliary spillway on the main dam, which is slightly higher than the primary spillway, and that was built in the 1970s to allow water to safely pass over the dam for reservoir safety. So in the end of July 2019, there were a number of large rainstorms over a few days, which caused the reservoir level to rise. The reservoir level filled the reservoir, and water started flowing over the auxiliary spillway. And this is a rather dramatic photo of water gushing down at high velocity, and it's a good photo demonstrating what happened when the auxiliary overtopped. Following the event, following that spill on the 1st of August, water material started to be seen eroding from underneath the spillway, and that caused a scour hole underneath, and some of the concrete slabs on the auxiliary spillway started to collapse. And this is a progression of photos showing how that progressed as more water flowed over the auxiliary spillway and sort of dribbled over and caused it more erosion of the scour hole. And resulting in this rather sort of dramatic photo, and useful to see people at scale here, showing how large this scour hole was, and obviously how much of a reservoir safety issue this was for the community downstream. So in response to this, the inspecting engineer and TRT and police issued an instruction to evacuate 1,500 residents who live downstream in Whaley Bridge. Then they proceeded to put in place emergency works to prevent overtopping of the damaged area. So put sandbags on the auxiliary spillway crest so that water no longer ran over the crest into the scour hole. And then they stabilized the damaged area. So this is a photo where the Chinook came in and dropped aggregate bags in the hole and covered it with concrete to seal it up and provide a more stable situation. At the same time, they reduced the reservoir inflow by blocking off the intake weir at the top end. So you can see these bags of aggregate and in gabion baskets covering the inflow weir, and they cover that with impermeable material, so water no longer entered the reservoir, but instead went round the bywash and was diverted around the reservoir. They also put in place a pumping plan to draw down the reservoir level with a number of temporary pumps, including the fire service, who brought that level down. So the reservoir level was drawn down by 12 meters from top water level down to about 4% full within 6 days. At that point, they carried out an hydrological assessment and dam safety assessment to confirm that the situation was safe, and then that allowed the residents to return. So that was on the 6th of August. The residents were out on the 7th of August, so the residents were allowed to return. And then after that, the pumps remained on site with the reservoir nearly empty. And this is a photo of the submersible temporary pumps there with the level drawn down. That was then they maintained a full-time site presence as well to be able to respond in case the situation got worse or in case the level rose. And obviously it was a very active, high profile and high risk site, so there was a heavy site presence. And put in place after that contingency planning to be able to decide how to manage the site safely. Also worked out a more permanent solution to reduce risk. We designed interim safety works by winter 2019, and this consisted of building a concrete structure across the auxiliary spillway. And this is a photo of it on the left, and that was so that water would be diverted away from the auxiliary spillway in the interim case. And that construction was completed in summer 2020. And then after that, the permanent work solution was designed. And I'm not going to speak about that. My focus of the talk is only going to go up to the summer 2020 when the interim safety works were completed. But on the bottom right here is a photo of the reservoir today with a level still drawn down and the area started to reseed itself. So that's a dramatic story, but it's a lot of on-site work there. And how did flood modelling support the incident recovery work? I think when we talk about this, the important thing to remember is what's the purpose of modelling. And modelling provides evidence to make better decisions with more confidence. And this is something that's obvious with all cases of modelling, and it's particularly evident if you think back to the last couple of years and the government response to COVID, and how much of the decision making that people were making under high pressure had to be was balanced and supported by the evidence that the modelling had provided. Without that, if you're trying to make decisions in a high pressure situation, and you don't have better information, you've got to trust on gut feel, and it's easy to make decisions on that you're not feel so fully supported by. So this is a real benefit that modelling can provide in any sort of environment such as that. So in this case, we used Flood Modeller, and we developed a routing model, and it was really quite a simple model, and Flood Modeller is very well designed for looking at this. It's well set up to look at this, and it's something that we've looked at a number of times for reservoir safety. So in a very simple case, a reservoir routing model has 4 main components. So it's got an inflow arrangement at the top with the catchment flow into the reservoir. We've got a storage element, which models the amount of change in level that you get with different changes in volume. There's an arrangement for the outflow of the reservoir, which models the outflow, obviously, and then the downstream boundary to take the water away. And it gives you an information such as this. So this is a graph showing some of the typical outputs from reservoir routing model. So you have an inflow, which is the dotted blue line, the outflow to the reservoir, which is the full blue line at the bottom, and then you can see the response to the reservoir as the level in the reservoir rises. And with that, we can estimate how whether the risk of water getting to particular heights, so for example in Toddbrook, with a risk that water will get over the primary spillway or the auxiliary spillway for different rainstorms of different magnitude. So the modelling timeline following the event, we were pulled in to the team to work on the project once the reservoir level had started being drawn down. We were tasked with trying to do an initial hydrological risk assessment, mainly focused on whether or not, how likely it is that the main dam would overtop, or how likely it is that the auxiliary spillway would work. And this was obviously a high pressure situation, and there was a lot of media covering scrutiny. So we were very time constrained. So in this case, we looked through the easily available data from CRT records, on-site measurements, and used theoretical estimates of things like the rating curves to try and build a quick routing model. And this was very conservative. It didn't account for lots of the elements in the system, but it accounted for the main elements. And we knew that that was actually going to give slightly conservative results, which was okay when you want to have a better, assume the worst in a case like this, then you'll be able to make that decision better. So this is a screenshot looking back as I was preparing this presentation. I found this screenshot of the initial model setup that we produced, and this is a very simple routing model, as I talked about. You've got the inflow, the storage area in the middle, and then an arrangement showing the main output. So we've got flow over the primary spillway, flow through the scour and draw off pipes that go through the dam, and then flow going out through the temporary pumps. And with this, we're able to estimate whether the risk of overtopping. And this is maybe a nicer map showing how that looks when you compare it to the arrangement on site. So we knew that there were elements which weren't included on this, and so that was really the next step. But this was enough at that stage to give them confidence to move forward and allow the residents to be returning to their homes. But we knew there was missing information, particularly focused on the area of the primary spillway and the bywash, which we identified was an area which was pretty important for understanding the system. So we commissioned a new topographic survey of the bywash channel, but obviously that would take a long time to arrive, and the information we needed information as soon as possible. So we created an interim model where we actually went on site and picked up survey at the bottom end of the bywash. So we did the survey in sort of two different stages. Firstly, we picked up the model of the survey at the bottom of the bywash, which is a critical area, and that was available much more quickly, so we could improve our estimates and give the site team more information. We added that key detail, and in each case where we needed, we used a conservative assumption so that we were always going to be slightly overestimating the risk. And we used that to develop initial site plans. And this is a schematic of the updated model. So the difference you can see from the previous first stab at the model was this extra element we've added here on the primary spillway. And this is, as I said at the beginning, this is where, because this spillway has a risk of becoming drowned out in some of the larger floods, if too much water goes down the bywash channel, it could back up and drown out this primary spillway. We've also added a sort of initial estimate of what the bywash capacity is using an abstraction unit from Flood Modeller Pro. So this model effectively allows a certain amount of water to pass around the reservoir, and so it doesn't get diverted into the main body, which is important because in each case here, we were assuming that the reservoir was drawn down by 12 meters, and it was all about how much the pumps could draw that water down, and so that was a pretty important consideration. We use this model to answer a lot of on-site plan questions and about the contingency plan, and to do some what-if questions. So, for example, what would be the benefit of reducing the number of submersible pumps on site? Whether the system, how would the system respond in floods if there were, say, 8 of them or fewer pumps on site, or if some of them were held back for redundancy, or perhaps whether the trust could scale back some of the pumps that they had on site. I think they were costing about 17 grand a day to hire the pump system. So obviously there was a big driver to try and only be using the information we needed. Similarly, we used the model to develop a bit of a rudimentary forecasting system. So, for example, we ran the model for a number of floods with different rainstorms, with different depths and different durations. And then we had that enabled the trust to have a lookup table, which showed they could look at the forecast rainfall and then look at the depth and duration of that rainstorm, and then they could easily look up the level that the reservoir was forecast to get to. So then they could start to have some confidence that they didn't have to look so nervously every time it rained about how the reservoir would respond, but instead they could understand when they needed to mobilize on site and warn the site team that there might be an issue, and when they maybe didn't need to do that. So whilst we had that model, we were always aware that there were some uncertainties in it and some extra things which weren't included. And so the topographic survey arrived, and we had that data in the beginning of October 2019. So it was about 2 months after the event. And that topographic survey, we used that to fill the data gaps, in particularly around the bywash channel. And at that point, we had a full model. We could do performance testing. We verified it to check that we were confident in the answers. And then we could repeat some of our initial work on the site plan to improve those estimates and answer a number of other questions. And as more data became available, we could continue to update that model with new extra bits of detail as and when it was needed. So this is a schematic of our updated model, and you can see this is what I would call the full model. This is where the modelers start to relax and feel like they've got all the information they need in there. And the main difference here is this very detailed model of the bywash channel around the side of the reservoir, and including some of the key structures along there, and also a better idea of the intake to the reservoir, and then some lateral inflows to distribute the water more realistically, or more appropriately, I guess, across the model. So this detail looks really heavy on the bywash. It looks like we've got a lot of information here, but the main risk, we were doing this to try and target this main risk, which we saw in the temporary case, which is about the bywash. And this is an example of a typically cross section of the bywash, which was put in with river units. You can see the channel is rectangular, and then next to it there's a footpath which sits between the channel and the reservoir. And the risk and the concern was that we would be, by diverting all the water into the bywash, we'd be putting a lot more water than it was designed for through that bywash, and that meant that there was a risk that water would overtop this footpath, would scour it away, and then would mean that the bywash no longer diverted water around it, but in fact all the water went straight into the reservoir, which would mean that it would all have to be pumped out, and it would mean that they had a lot less control over the lake level and the reservoir level. So that's why we put all this additional detail in, and the model was really successful in achieving that. This is an example of the long section through the reservoir, through the bywash channel, sorry, and from there you can see it shows, it really highlights the locations of overtopping. This blue line is the flow profile when the bywash is flowing full, and then the sort of tan line shows the level of the right bank of that footpath between the channel and the reservoir. So you can see it highlights these locations where water will first likely to overtop, and then some other areas in other places. And from there we could go on site, and the site team put up sandbags on the footpath, and then they could add that to the contingency plan, so that if there was a risk the bywash would be full, they could go and send someone there to mobilize on site and monitor it and react to the situation. So we could be a lot more targeted, because this bywash is about 1.3 kilometers long, so it's quite difficult to be having a team there all the time to monitor every area. We also used the model to site a new gauging station, which went through to the Trust's online system, so that it fed the data through, and then we could target that at the right location to the place where the water would be most likely to get out, and then we could use that as well to improve the flood warning system and develop something slightly rudimentary here to be able to predict risk with a good lead time. With that final model, we could review our initial results, assumptions, develop the contingency plan, and we also use that model to design the interim safety measures, and provided the evidence for the government investigations and as they went forward. So I think that in terms of reflecting on this, we used a real risk-based decision-making approach here, and this is it was sort of forced really, but it was a really good example because we were very time pressured. This is how way we had to adopt to it. So, and if you plot these 4 stages on a graph here, you can look at that over time. As we added more confidence, we gradually added more confidence and detail in the model. And you can look at that, the contrast to that is that meant over time we reduced the risk to the site. We were able to provide better confidence for people to make better decisions there. And that also reduced the conservatism that we had to employ on site. So for example, we could scale back the on-site team and the on-site works. And that meant that we could be more targeted and the response overall could be more cost effective. And that was really supported by the benefits that modeling and the data gave to the trust. Another reflection on this is this phrase which kept coming up in the conversations that we had between the modeling team and the engineering team. And this is one of the real benefits, I think, from this, and takeaway messages from me from this project, is this risk awareness is better than risk aversion. The way we were set up, because it was all we were all pulling together in the team to resolve the situation. And there was really sensible and really mature conversations between the modeling team and the engineering team and the clients. We were all communicating really well, and it was great that the modeling team were involved in the conversations, in the delivery of the response. We were sort of embedded deep in that team, and that meant that we could, whilst we didn't have all the information at the time, we could at each stage we could highlight the areas we knew we didn't know, and we could then make the right representation we could do, but we would always be able to communicate that risk back to the design team. So for example, we might not have all the information about the bywash, but let's agree the decision we're going to take, and then let's understand and understand together what that might mean. So for example, we might be underestimating something, but that might mean we're overestimating the reservoir level, and so we should be interpreting the results in that way. And that meant that instead of us as a modeling team holding back and trying to do all we can do to avert that risk, we don't want to be taking any risks here. Well, that's a very stressful situation, and it's not realistic. And it means that ultimately you end up with a more expensive and slower project, because if you need to be getting all the data before you can release any information, then you end up not being as responsive as you need to for a project like this. But instead, if you're able to communicate and highlight those main areas and be aware of the risks and communicate those to everyone who needs to in terms of the project stakeholders, then it led to overall a better situation. And in this case, it was really great. The work we were doing in the modeling was really well received by the client, and it was nice that at the end of the project, the trust issued a thank you letter to Mott MacDonald and the team, and they specifically thanked the modelers in that, which I think is really great, because sometimes modelers get sort of in the background, but in this case we were very embedded in the delivery process. So what can modeling teach us about the incident? So modeling can be used after an event, in this case to review what's happened before, to test our assumptions and test what we did, and to try and learn for future. And in this case, Toddbrook is such a huge, nationally significant event that there's a real benefit in doing this. So as we were reviewing the site afterwards, we were struck by how critical the bywash was in reservoir safety. So the model predicts the bywash would convey about 2.5 cumex constantly around the side of the reservoir. That's equivalent to about 12 of the installed submersible pumps on site. So the presence of the bywash meant that they didn't need to be running the pumps continuously, and that had a significant saving of cost and carbon to the trust. And it also meant that you're basically bypassing the base flow around the reservoir. So you didn't, in the event, it meant that you were pumping less volume, and you actually had less reservoir volume in the reservoir to pass over the auxiliary spillway. And with our work in reservoir safety, all too often we're encountering issues of where bywash structures are poorly maintained, they're vandalized, or they're deteriorated. And this incident provides us with a really good opportunity to quantify the benefits of the bywash for future management, particularly in terms of the benefits during an emergency situation. And this is something that we looked at and we presented with the trust in the paper in the ICE journal, Downstream Reservoirs. So to test this, we used our existing model and looked at 2 what-if scenarios. So firstly, we looked at, in this case, for this event, what would have happened if the bywash hadn't been operational at all. So for example, if it had been left to go and there was no flow was able to go through it. So in this case, we removed that channel from the model, and all water just went straight to the reservoir and had to pass across the spillway or the primary or auxiliary spillways. And secondly, we looked at a second situation where the biowash was in poorly maintained condition. So in this case, it was halved, the capacity was halved, and we compared that to the capacity of the biowash that the model predicts in its clean and clear situation. Our design flood for this we used was the flood from the end of July and August 2019. So we used the rainfall data from the EA and generated that rainfall and ran it through the model to estimate the reservoir level. And this is a plot of it here. And you can see the model level in the reservoir as it goes above this is the primary spillway level, the auxiliary spillway level, and this is the sort of top of the auxiliary spillway because it's sloped. You can see over the reservoir level rising, going over the auxiliary spillway for a long time. And then this is a point where the modelling stopped, because this is where the inspecting engineer came on site and started to pull and draw down the level. They started to draw down the level with pumps, so we couldn't look beyond then. But we ran that model so this is our nicely clean 2.5 cumet pump bywash channel. We ran it as well for 2 further situations, which I just described. And this is the response. This is how the model predicts the reservoir level would have responded in each of those cases. The first thing to say, I think, here is how it's clear how much of an impact the bywash channel had on the reservoir level, particularly in this case of the do nothing situation. So the model predicts that if in this situation the bywash hadn't been there, or I suppose perhaps as well if something had failed and it had become blocked for some reason or other and it wasn't able to be used, the reservoir level would have risen, and it would have overtopped this auxiliary spillway, and for a long period of time, from the 28th of July all the way through to the end of the model run. And this would have put a lot of pressure on the auxiliary spillway. And whilst the actual peak level of the reservoir didn't change in the model as a result of the bywash, it means that the auxiliary spillway would have been passing flow throughout the whole period, and that would have meant that more volume and more flow would have meant that it would have likely caused more significant damage. And there's another implication here, which is that even the runs here in yellow show the smaller, lower capacity bywash. And the results of this are surprisingly similar to the bywash with a larger capacity. And it implies really that if the presence of the bywash on its own to pass the base flow and pass water around the side of the reservoir away from the main body would have had a benefit on its own. And I think that this is a really interesting implication more widely for management of reservoirs. And I think it highlights that, in my mind, the bywash is a bit of an unsung hero, really, in this case. But that's the benefit that modelling can give us for reviewing and hopefully taking forward lessons for more widely. So, what can I take away from this for my next project, or for your next project? So Toddbrook Reservoir is an incident there was nationally significant reservoir safety. It will influence policy going forward. And it's an important reminder that whilst we do a lot of these sort of flood studies and reservoir safety assessments, there are real world connotations and implications. And the design of reservoir safety is one of the most important elements that hydrologists and flood modelers can work on, just because of the safety implications. In this case, it made national news, and it led to 1,500 people being evacuated for 6 days. It's a very significant risk. We responded to this with modelling, providing support to the decision makers to help them to understand how they can safely manage the site. And over time, we gradually added more detail to that model to give people the ability to make those decisions with more confidence. We used a risk-based decision-making process. So as we added that extra information, it allowed people to make less conservative decisions about how to manage the site, and that meant that they could make more cost-effective and targeted response to managing that site. At the end, we can use modelling as well to look back and review on what's just happened, and to reflect on what maybe we could do better next time, or how we can manage situations better in the future.